Another method of attaining territory was to buy it. In debt from the disastrous Crimean War, Imperial Russia was open to selling their territory across the Bering Strait, Russian Alaska. Its vast untamed wilderness was ridiculed as a dreary waste of glaciers, ice, white bears, and walruses. But U.S. Secretary of State William H. Seward had his eye on this piece of property since 1860. Seward saw Alaska's strategic value for trade or in the event of war. He also pictured potential in Alaska's resources, especially timber and furs. Seward was so eager to secure Alaska, he entered into negotiations with the Russian envoy, the Baron Eduard de Steckel, without the go-ahead of the President or Congress. On March 30th, 1867, Seward and de Steckel signed the Treaty of Cessation. The U.S. agreed to purchase Alaska from the Russians for $7.2 million, only 2.5 cents an acre. Few Americans viewed Alaska as a bargain. The press mocked the purchase as Seward's folly and Seward's icebox. But nearly 1 year later, Alaska became a U.S. territory. In the early 1800s, missionaries from New England made the arduous journey to Hawaii to spread Christianity. They misinterpreted the Hawaiian culture, believing that living in a paradise had kept the Hawaiians from progressing.
Instead of grasping all he can get, he divides with his neighbor and confidently expects his neighbor to divide with him.
While the native Hawaiians were content to live in their traditional ways, a growing influx of Americans was busily building huge plantations, railways, docks, and hotels. They soon dominated the island's economy and made their influence felt in government. In January 1891, Hawaii's native king Kalakaua died, and his sister Liliuokalani ascended to the throne. Although she was educated in the U.S., she rallied against U.S. rule. Hawaii for Hawaiians. In 1893, American plantation owners plotted a revolt with the help of U.S. Ambassador John L. Stevens. When the U.S. battleship Boston arrived, Queen Liliuokalani saw that resistance was hopeless and sadly surrendered her throne. After William McKinley became president, Hawaii was annexed in 1898. The second half of the 19th century found Spain holding tenuously to their empire. Cuba and Puerto Rico in the Caribbean, the Philippines and Guam in the Pacific. Meanwhile, in the U.S., the expansionist mood was at a fever pitch, with U.S. investments in Cuban sugar and mining industries steadily rising. In 1870, young Cuban Jose Marti had his first success as a rebel. He penned a patriotic poem against Spanish rule. His tenacious spirit provided the Cuban people a national hero and hope of ending colonial rule. In 1894, Marti organized guerrilla actions, destroying U.S.-owned sugarcane plantations, hoping to provoke U.S. intervention in the Cuban plight against Spain. Spain sent an army under General Valeriano Weyler to crush the rebellion. Jose Marti was killed, but his revolution blazed on. Frustrated by rebel successes, General Weyler ordered 300,000 Cuban civilians into concentration camps. Thousands died, and the revolution seemed lost. On January 25, 1898, the USS Maine steamed into Havana Harbor. Outwardly, its mission was to help quell the conflict between the Cubans and Spanish. An explosion ripped through the underbelly of the Maine, killing 266 men. The American headline screamed, "It was a Spanish mine." "Remember the Maine" became a rallying cry as the American public was whipped into a frenzy. While the U.S. Congress prepared a declaration of war against Spain, forces were deployed to the Caribbean and the Pacific. U.S. Navy warships moved in to blockade the harbor of Havana, Cuba's capital. And President McKinley issued a call for 125,000 volunteers. Infuriated, Spain declared war on the U.S. 2 days later, on April 25th, the U.S. reciprocated. On the other side of the world, in the Pacific, Commodore George Dewey received orders to seek the Spanish fleet and capture or destroy it. The Philippines had been oppressed by the Spanish crown for more than 400 years, provoking many revolutions. When the U.S. declared war on Spain, Filipino rebel Emilio Aguinaldo saw a way for the Philippines to achieve independence. On May 1st, Dewey surprised the Spanish fleet in Manila Bay and sank all 10 Spanish ships. During the next 3 months, some 11,000 U.S. troops joined with the Filipino rebels to defeat the Spanish. Aguinaldo declared Philippine independence on June 12th. With the Philippines seemingly under control, U.S. troops moved on to capture Guam. With the situation in hand in Cuba and the Pacific, the U.S. now turned 18,000 troops and a naval escort on another Spanish colony in the Caribbean, Puerto Rico. They landed at Guanica Bay, but before they could reach the capital city, Spain agreed to sign a peace treaty with the United States, putting an end to all military hostilities. The war was over in just 4 months. The truce with Spain was signed on August 12, 1898. It was a splendid little war, commented soon-to-be Secretary of State John Hay. On December 10, 1898, the Treaty of Paris was signed, giving the United States the right to occupy Cuba with full control over Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines. In the Philippines, Emilio Aguinaldo and his supporters were angered as one colonial power was replaced with another. On February 4, 1899, he declared war on the U.S. forces in the islands. It was a brutal war of massacre and torture, with U.S. forces taking on an ugly role, forcing Filipino civilians to live in areas where disease, hunger, and poor sanitation killed thousands, much as the Spanish under Butcher Weyler did in Cuba. In the end, more than 20,000 Filipino rebels and some 4,000 Americans were dead. At home, anti-imperialists complained that the war's purpose was to free Spain's colonies, but the result was the U.S. becoming an imperial power. The famed American writer Mark Twain sarcastically noted,
"There must be two Americas, one that sets the captive free and one that takes the once captive's new freedom away."
Ultimately, the U.S. Supreme Court decided how new territories would be handled. Puerto Rico became an incorporated territory, allowing Puerto Ricans to become U.S. citizens and the right to vote on statehood. On the other hand, the Philippines remained unincorporated. In 1902, Filipinos held elections for their House of Representatives, a first step on their long journey toward independence.